evening everyone, and how are you doing on this beautiful autumnal day? And it's gonna be Halloween next week. Yes, I cannot wait. I'm so excited. It's gonna be so much fun. So today we're going to be talking about one of the Halloween costumes I made. I've been wanting to make this costume for years. I saw this one picture here and it gave me such inspiration, and I thought, what a unique and fun way to have a costume, and then it's so effective and really gives the illusion of having a toadstool, and it just looked so good. And then in my research I saw so many different ways that people had created a toadstool costume. Now I absolutely have always loved these little toadstools. I know they're probably freaking toxic, but there is something magical about it, because growing up I would read fairy stories, and like little brownies would live in these toadstools, or fairies would go plant them in the real world instead of in fairyland. And you know, there's also in Alice in Wonderland where they're eating from the mushroom. And I don't know, it's always just been a really like cute fun thing. I remember like one of my birthday parties, I think it was my 6th birthday party, and it still is one of my most fondest memories, and I spent years and years wanting to recreate this, is that we sat on little toadstools, and it was just so special to me. I cannot describe it. And then throughout the years I've tried making those toadstool cushions, or I would find a bench and I would paint it as a toadstool. So it was finally the opportunity for me to create my own. So let's talk about how I made this costume. Right, it was interesting because there were so many different varieties of ways that I'd seen people do it, and using cardboard and other different methods, and I didn't want to do that. I want to be able to create a garment that was going to be a long-term thing and last for a while. So what I did is I found a sombrero hat, and through this I was able to get an idea for the shape that we wanted, because we wanted it to be wide but we didn't want it to be too wide and then all shaped. So I actually cut off about an inch around the sombrero so we could make it more flat, have more shape, not be too big. And then I was able to get some gaffer tape, and I just made the edges smooth, because the thing with a straw hat is that it's layered, so you don't want it to fray out, so you want to keep it contained. So that's the best way to do it. And also it's another way to be able to have traction for your thread to be attached to it. Now after you trim that down, what you want to be able to do is to create a base so you can sew on your fabric. So using the same linen that I had bought, I cut a square and then I laid it out on the bottom of the sombrero, and then I just pinned it to mold it, because I knew that it was going to change shape, and you just kind of want it so it sits flush. And then you can chop around the inside and then leave about a centimetre around the brim, centimetre, 2 centimetres, so you can turn it up and hand stitch it down, and that will give you the base that you can stitch everything onto, so you're not stitching through the straw, and it's a very strong firm base that you want to create. Now if you're also worried about stitching to the base, you can do that, but I also found gluing it as well helped a lot, because then it was a bit more sturdy and it wasn't going to fly anywhere. But I did do a bit of a whip stitch around it, because you can never go wrong with a whip stitch, honestly. Now here comes the part that's going to take about 24 hours to hand sew, but it's totally worth it, because it looks good. And also I got to catch up on a lot of Once Upon a Time. I didn't realize how good season 1 was. It was so good. But you know what, the best thing about it is Captain Hook. Can't deny that. I'm just very much like, take me away with you. Right, back to the sewing. So what we're going to do is something that will drive you absolutely mad, but it's going to look so good. So when you look at a toadstool underneath, they have all these, like, what would you call it? Pleats. There are so many different pleats inside of a toadstool. So we wanted to recreate that on the hat. I had this idea of like having it go wavy as well, but I found as I started to do all these pleats and stitch them down, there was no need to add anything else. It was going to be perfect and look so good. Now, I ended up just cutting strips that were a bit wider than the brim so I could just pleat them and go along. So you want to have like maybe a 5 centimeter pleat for each one. And I'm having flashbacks to a job where we just spent days pleating. So when pinning these pleats, you just feel what feels good for you, because some of them might be big, some of them might be small. You don't actually want perfect symmetry because you're trying to create something organic that matches something that is from the earth. And then you pin that all down.
2,000 years later.
Now, here comes the next 20 hours of the portion. Oh, now I've found when pinning it, I realized it was probably easier if we had cut the fabric on the bias. So I cut it on the straight, we want to cut it on the bias, because then you'll have more give around the fabric, because I get to the point where I'm like, oh, I cannot physically manipulate this fabric anymore. So I kept cutting it so I could get it in different segments, but it was okay because it was organic. If you're going to do this, I think cutting on the bias will be better for you, because that means you have the stretch and you can manipulate it much easier than it was for me. But it still looks amazing no matter what you do. Now, here comes the next 20 hours of the portion of, the next 16 hours of the portion. You're going to hand sew it all down. And I know this may seem daunting if you're not proficient seamstress, but it is very therapeutic in the long run, and you will enjoy it because you just want to be able to achieve something and go, wow, did I really do that? Like, that took forever. Wow, but it looks so good.
Many unbearable hours later.
I love it. I look like a toadstool. And then I've actually just decided to sew this in a little bit so it's not so pointy, it's more curved, and it's going to sit nicer. So now you've got this amazing base. You want to be able to create the toadstool mushroom shape. So what I did is I used a sheet of wadding and I molded it over it. Now you can either cut in a circle or cut in a square. I always find it's better to cut things in squares that are a bit wider, because then you can manipulate it more and have more give in case you don't have enough of the fabric or wadding. And then once I started to pin down, you kind of don't want to make it too taut on the hat. You want to make it very soft so it's more organic, because like it might bend a little bit, it might have a bit more waves into it, and it'll just make it a bit more, repeated word, organic. That's what we want. We want it to look like nature, don't we? We want it to be as realistic as possible. Now, to give it also the firmness, I had some toy wadding left over from the pumpkins, so I was able to stuff that into one of the gaps, and then I gave it more support and it wasn't going to sag, and I really would suggest doing that. That was such a lifesaver. I'm so pleased I had that extra wadding. And then of course you're going to whip stitch that beauty all the way around, and that's why you have that extra bit of fabric of the lining so you can attach it to it, and that's no problem whatsoever. Now the next part is where it's really going to come together, and you're going to finally see it coming together as a toadstool. I got this beautiful piece of burgundy felt. You can use a red felt, but I wanted to make it not so garish. I wanted to make it very gentle, and I'm so happy I found this. And again, cut it in a square because that is the easiest way to work with it. And then you just lay it over the top, and then you mold it. So again, do not pull it taut because felt does stretch. You want it to be very gentle on this base, and then you just gently pin it around so it all sits soft. And then I found, because of the nature of the fabric, it was bunching up, but I used it to my advantage, because okay, let's make some pleats as well, because maybe it grew in like the shade or the sun and it kind of went like this as it grew up from the ground, so we can use that to our advantage. Once you're happy with the pinning, you're going to stitch this down. I used a very teeny tiny whip stitch, but if you want to like do a big whip stitch, or if you want to do a running stitch, absolutely do what's best for you. So I cut and stitched as I went along because I wanted to make sure the fabric still sit flush against it. Okay, so you know that linen that you had still left over? Do not throw that away. You're going to use it for the spots. And I just did everything freehand. Like I did some big spots, I did some crooked spots, I did some small spots. So I had pinned all my spots down all over the hat, and I was like, wow, it looks like a mushroom. But then I realized it didn't look real. As bizarre as that sounded, it looked more like, you know, is it Toshi from Mario Kart, you know, the little kitty? And that's when my character became very, very Japanese, cutie, cheeky little cartoon character. So because it didn't feel organic, I went and looked at all these pictures I had researched with toadstools, and I saw that they weren't perfect circles. They were all like 3D, higgledy-piggledy, more around the bottom. So that's what I did. I cut up the tiniest little pieces of fabric, and then I started putting it around on the edge, so it's more like, you know, it's coming from the bottom going up, and then it's spreading the white. So that's when it really started to feel more organic about it.
Oh yeah.
So once you're happy with everything, that's when you get around to stitching it. I did a tiny whip stitch around all of it, and I realized as I was whip stitching the tiny ones, it was very difficult. I won't lie to you about that. So I got some fabric glue in the end, and I was able to glue down the tiny ones. But because I'd already started sewing all the big ones, and it was starting to fray around the linen, I did decide to do like a mini, but like a big whip stitch around all the tiny ones, so it still had that fray around the edge, if you know what I mean, because you wanted to keep it the symmetry all together. And once I'd done all that, and I stepped back, and I'm like, okay, this fraying linen might cause a problem in the long run because I might lose the thread and its attachment to the felt. So what I did was that I actually got the same fabric glue, and I went around the edges lightly, because then it made it a bit more crusty, if you know what I mean. And I felt like it was more fused with the fabric, and it wasn't so blocky. And I found that really effective, and it actually looked really good. So once you're happy with how your whole fabulous hat looks, like maybe how fabulous this hat looks, I'm going to absolutely wear this to work this week. So now that this hat looks amazing, what we're going to do is we're now going to go work on the main portion of the whole costume to tie everything together. So you have your ultimate toadstool goals. Very My Fair Lady, but in like autumn fairy style, isn't it? What we're going to do is that I was very inspired again as it started to become very Japanese, and this one picture I'd seen, he was kind of like this, and he had big baggy sleeves, and he just looked incredible, this one picture. And I was like, I'm gonna make a kimono. So making a basic kimono is actually really easy. It's just all about squares and rectangles. So lucky for me, I had a vintage kimono in my stash, and I used that as a basic block pattern because we want to create a rectangle for here. I did 2 pieces, so one on either side. Then we're going to take a long rectangle here, a long rectangle at the back, and you sort it. And then also you have to have a long rectangle that goes around your neck. And it is that easy. Really, it is. So I set to work recreating the pattern with the same linen that I used here. So it all tied together. Now, if you want to have a bit more of an explanation about how to copy patterns from an existing garment, have a look at this video somewhere here, and you'll be able to go back to that and have a bit more of an understanding about it. So now that you've cut it all out, leaving some seam allowance, you're going to sew it all together. You're going to sew down here, you're going to sew down here, you're going to sew up to here, and you're going to sew here. Now we're not going to sew the shoulders all together yet, and that's for a reason that you're about to see. Why are we not going to sew that together? Well, we want to create the decorative part of the toadstool, don't we? Now on toadstools, you always see they have things hanging from here. It's like a pleated skirt, isn't it? That's all like tatty, like a pixie skirt. That's it. It's a pixie skirt hanging from the toadstool, isn't it? So we want to recreate that, so we're going to put it here. Now I set to work using all the scraps I had and using a bit of variety of linens to create that higgledy-piggledy thing that was going to drape. I just got a basic shape and then I just was creative with the shape that I wanted. And just go wild, be free, have fun, and just enjoy the process of creating a shape that you want to carry on. When you're happy with what the shape's going to be, you're going to sew it all into place so then you can transfer it onto your shoulder. So it's quite simple what we're going to do. We're going to pin the artistic panel you created onto the front of the kimono, and you're going to do it to the back as well, and then you can sew those together. Now I left this one free because then I was able to fit it into the sleeve that way and then continue the line, and then you're going to sew up the armhole. So now that you're happy with how that looks, you're going to attach the collar. Now I'm so thankful I did this. I actually cut it far too big. What a blessing in disguise, because I was able to continue doing some machine pleats along the front, so it was more texture, so we were matching everything together. And that means like when we went from here to the bottom, that was going to be very, very neutral. It all flowed seamlessly. So if you have enough fabric, I would suggest also lining definitely the whole thing. The sleeves not so much, because you still want the sleeves to flow, don't you? So maybe you could make it a facing and put it around the sleeves, and maybe make the facing 3 to 4 inches, and then you can just lightly sew it down. Now we're going to be artistic yet again. Like, it looked amazing, don't get me wrong. I was like, oh, it looks just like a toadstool, but we wanted to create depth. We want to be able to see the shadows, and that it's been outside, and there might be mud on it, and there might be a little bit of dirt, and there might be a little bit of sun damage. We just want to make it as organic as possible, because when we're in the forest and we need to hide from people, we can just go into our natural sewed look. So this is where we get to be creative. I had a couple of my watercolor paints actually that I was able to use to create the tone, because you want to make it subtle, but you don't want to make it garish. And you need to find the perfect balance. And what I did using these 3 different colors and using a lot of water to tone it down, I just went around the edges of everything and painted it down, and then maybe putting a little bit of spots every now and then, and just do what you think is best to make it look as organic as possible. Now there is something I forgot to tell you. So I stopped the kimono and then I realized this needs something else. Absolutely. So using one of my favorite medieval patterns, I made some, as I like to professionally call them, wrister cuffs. So there was a little deep V going here, and then I just cut them here so we could put some elastic around it. And then I went and did the same thing. I created the little higgledy-piggledy, technical term, higgledy-piggledy, did you know? And I painted it, and then because there was such a harsh line where I stopped, I wanted to make it flow. So I cut more of these little dots and I glued them down, and I painted around them as well. And then it just was very seamless, because then I painted definitely around the wrist here of the kimono, and it was just like an emerging bit. It was just another extension. Like the toadstool could have been like this in the woods and been like, you know, artistic toadstool style. Just be artistic. That's the whole hashtag of this scenario. Be artistic. Now I also had this amazing vibe going, but this definitely needed to have some painting. I'd already planned to do it, but adding some of this paint into it. So what I would do is I would paint in here, and then I would get another thicker paintbrush with lots of water on it, so blend it out, making it really, really effortless and really, really seamless, and just any other artistic words you want to insert here for being awesome, pretty much. Now, this is a very important part. You want to actually go around all these wee dots, and it looks really good, I have to say. So going around all these dots really brings the whole costume together, and you want to be very, very gentle with the painting, because you don't want it to be too garish. You want it to be very soft, so I do suggest using lots of water. to have a mild look. I hope that's been a really fabulous explanation, but we've come to the most important thing. Becoming a toadstool in the wild. This video from one little toadstool to you. I hope you have a very spooky, ooky, fabulous Halloween. And until next time, bye.